Good afternoon, and welcome to The Appeal Live, a co-production of Now This and The Appeal. I'm your host for today, Jay Willis. With increasing frequency, we're seeing candidates across the country winning local DA and prosecutor elections, running on platforms that promise to do something maybe a little different from what people are used to their prosecutors doing things like ending mass incarceration and reducing the number and length of criminal sentences. Voters understand that what prosecutors believe and how they do their jobs really matters and really has an impact on their local communities. And obviously, this is especially true in major population centers like New York City, where in 2018, the Manhattan DA's office handled more than 55,000 cases, making it one of the largest and most powerful DA offices in the country. Now, just on the heels of the 2020 election, voters in Manhattan will have an opportunity to elect a new DA in the fall of 2021. And that is why we are here today, to discuss some of these issues that are facing New York City with the whopping 8 candidates who are, as of now, running for it. And I say as of now because your incumbent is Cy Vance, who took office more than a decade ago in 2010. He hasn't yet said whether he will run for re-election. And if he does not run or loses, whoever is elected in 2021 would be just the 5th elected DA in Manhattan since 1938. To date, all of Manhattan's elected DAs have been white men. As I mentioned, we are joined today by candidates for the office of the District Attorney of Manhattan to learn about why they're running and what, if anything, they would do differently if they were elected to make sure they're actually using the office's power to keep people safe. They are Assemblymember Dan Quart, former Manhattan ADAs Lucy Lang, Liz Crotty, and Diana Florence, former New York State Chief Deputy Attorney General Alvin Bragg, former Brooklyn DA General Counsel Holly Farhadian Weinstein, Public Defender Eliza Orlins, and Civil Rights Attorney Tahani Abushi. All 8 of you, thank you so much for joining me. I'm sure these virtual forums are a joy for you to keep convening. We appreciate your time and your patience with it. But we don't have a lot of time, and there are a lot of you, so we want to get right into it. The People's Coalition for Manhattan DA Accountability, which includes organizations working to end mass incarceration, recently released a set of survey responses from you, the candidates, on issues ranging from cutting the office's budget to supporting sentencing reductions. Eliza and Tahani, I want to start with you because you were the only 2 who committed to cutting the DA's office budget by 50% as a way to reduce the footprint of the office and the number of cases it charges. Eliza, I will ask you first, and I'll give each candidate, to which I then turn, 60 seconds. Eliza, tell me about why you supported this and how you envision the mechanics of a 50% budget cut happening.
Yes, well, thank you so much. And I'm excited to be here with all of you today. So as the only candidate who's spent my entire career as a public defender going up against the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, I've seen just the way in which that budget is actually used. It's used to over-prosecute, over-incarcerate, overcharge, and destroy the lives of the people like my clients, Black and brown people, lower income people, people who are LGBTQIA, people with disabilities, those who are not powerful and not well connected. And in my career, in seeing the way in which these cases get prosecuted, the majority of cases that get prosecuted are low-level offenses, are things that are crimes of poverty, issues where my clients are experiencing mental health issues or substance use disorder. And I will decline to prosecute a whole host of cases. This is truly the way in which we will decrease the footprint of that office. We don't need so many district attorneys there. We don't need so much staff there because we need to prosecute fewer cases. And by prosecute fewer cases,
Thanks, Eliza. I'm really sorry. I've got to make sure I get to everybody. Tahani, same question. Tell me about why you supported this and how you envision the mechanics happening. Again, 60 seconds.
The fight for criminal justice reform, to me, it's not a stepping stone in my career, nor is it a job. This is my life. And when I was 14, my father was sentenced to 22 years in prison. And overnight, my mom became a single parent of 10 children. And so I've seen the damage and destruction of this office and how it impacts literally every single aspect of our lives and how it targets communities of color. This budget is bloated because it thrives on prosecuting poverty and other social inequities. And once we decline to prosecute those charges, we are going to see that budget reduce dramatically. And once we also instead partner with our community-based organizations to address these circumstances to actually achieve stability, we will see that incarceration and prosecution is not the way to public safety, but is a way of exacerbating, destabilizing, and destroying communities.
Tahani, thank you. I'll turn to the rest of you now, who again did not commit to reducing the budget by 50%. My question for you, obviously slightly different. And Diana, I will ask you first. Do you think the DA's office budget should be reduced at all? And if so, by how much? Again, Diana, 60 seconds.
Thank you. You know, I was the former chief of the first of its kind construction fraud task force, and I know firsthand that there is a crime wave. $50 billion a year is what wage theft costs our country. And there is housing fraud that exists in our city where tenants are harassed out of their homes. We need to be recommitting the office away from crimes of poverty to crimes of power. And that is going to take resources. So I can't commit to a reduction. I need to see how we first reallocate the resources of the office to those types of cases. Once we do that after the first year, then we look and see what we can do. But the reality is those cases will not only help everyday New Yorkers, like working people, because that's who I'm supported by. I have 13 labor unions, but we'll also make sure that we refill our tax coffers through asset forfeiture, but also through enforcement. I know this because I have done this work.
Thank you, Diana. I've got to move on now to Dan. Same question. Should the DA budget be reduced? And if so, by how much? 60 seconds.
Yes, the district attorney's office is bloated, and I've come out with a decline to prosecute list, and I will certainly cut the budget. But it is irresponsible to suggest a cut of this significant nature this quickly. By example, if you were to cut the budget by 50% within the first term and do it 12.5% a year, that would be almost $21 million in budget cuts that you would have to identify within 100 days of taking office. I'm certainly committed to reducing this footprint of this office. I fought for decarceration and actually achieved it in Albany over my 10 years. I'm an experienced and seasoned litigator, but what you don't do is promise what you can't deliver. And none of us will be able to identify that large of cuts within the first 100 days of office. And that's the timetable that we would have to go before the city council and identify those budget cuts. That's why I'm not promising that. Everyone knows about my work in Albany, and I will cut this footprint.
Thank you, Dan. I appreciate it. Same question next to Liz, please. Not so much.
Oh, sorry. Hi, sorry about that.
Liz, you're with us. I love to see it.
Yeah, I mean, I think with coronavirus and the pandemic, New York State is facing billion-dollar budget gaps. So I think the reality is that every city, state agency is going to have some sort of reduction in order to have some sort of to balance the state and city budget. And the district attorney's office being a state office run out of the city, it's a hybrid. And so I think there's going to be no choice but to actually cut the budget. But that said, with discovery reforms that were passed in January of 2020, these are extensive human resources issues in which people have to support staff has to be used in order to get discovery to defense attorneys and to people within a timely amount of time. That takes manpower. Also, too, the job of the district attorney's office is to get it right. It's not to convict, it's to get it right. And if you get it right, that means thorough investigation. And to thoroughly investigate these crimes, you need people. You're going to have to, honestly, every agency.
Thank you, Talia. I've got to move on now. Or, excuse me, Liz. I've got to move on now. But there's a hint as to who I'm going to ask next. Talia, same question.
Thank you, Jay. Look, we have to divest from the cases that don't advance public safety. I think everybody here agrees on that. But here are some other things that justice demands we do and that I want to do, which require resources. So, for example, I want to build a robust conviction review unit. I supervise the premier conviction review unit in the country over in the Brooklyn DA's office. And so I know that For conviction review to really be meaningful, it has to be fully staffed with lawyers as well as investigators who are able to take on a wide swath of cases and actually burrow down into the facts of them. Gender-based violence, I think we have to totally start over in how we think about this violence and to take it seriously and to investigate and prosecute it with the moral commitment that it deserves. And that means having prosecutors, investigators, social workers who are fully trained and able to handle these cases. We need more social workers in these offices, and I could go on. And that's why I can't answer a question like this until I get in there and see what is really available and how the resources are being distributed.
Thank you, Tali. Alvin, same question. Should the DA budget be reduced? And if so, by how much?
So I'm the only candidate here who spent his entire life being over-policed and living in a community that's been over-policed. So I know the downside of the misdemeanor docket, which is 82% of all cases in New York City. That's where I'm going to focus cutting those dockets. But we need to shift to cases that focus on true public safety. That's what I spent my entire career on, following the money to the source of the problem. So that means looking at gun traffickers who sit far away from our city and sell guns illegally that are then brought here. That means looking at sex crimes and doing the kind of cases I did looking at Harvey Weinstein or the Buffalo Catholic Church, entities that are being investigated for serial sexual assault conduct. We need money to invest in that, so I'll shift away from the misdemeanor docket and invest there, like I've done throughout my career. Thank you.
Thank you, Alvin. Last but certainly not least, thanks for your patience, Lucy. Same question.
Jay, there is no question that the criminal justice system is bloated and sprawling, and that has come at great expense to our communities, in particular communities of color. Look, I was a city kid. I'm a parent. I've been a teacher in prisons, a former assistant district attorney who has worked with survivors of the most heinous violent crimes, and I'm a national criminal justice reformer. Community-based solutions and restorative justice are vital to addressing trauma and preserving dignity to make our city safe and healthy. It means treating kids like kids, treating substance use and mental health conditions as health problems, and ending mass incarceration. I'm committed to significantly and substantially decreasing the district attorney's office budget, but I can't say as I sit here right now whether that will be by 50%, by 30%, or by 70%. There's a tremendous backlog of cases as a result of COVID-19, and there are tremendous demands of the community that the district attorney must invest in. And that's the kind of district attorney that I intend to be.
Thank you each so much. I'm going to move from one budget to another budget. One of the main issues we see emerging in this campaign is the interaction of the DA's office and debates over the New York City Police Department budget. There are plenty of folks who are calling for shifting money away from sort of traditional policing and instead investing in community-led safety programs and non-police emergency first responders, some of which you've touched on in your first answer to my question here. At a recent mayoral forum, for example, candidate Diane Morales called for a $3 billion cut to the NYPD's $6 billion, give or take, annual spending plan. Now, last year, Mayor de Blasio proposed and the city council passed a budget that claimed to cut about $1 billion from the NYPD. But those cuts actually just mostly shifted the function of police in schools from the NYPD to the Department of Education. Kind of a little bit of a shell game here if we're talking about meaningful divestments. Now, as district attorney, your policies impact how police do their jobs, but you can also use your office's bully pulpit for advocacy. At a recent forum, three of you, Tali, Diana, and Liz, said that you did not want to reduce funding to the police department, and the rest of you said that you would to various degrees. So I'd like to ask first the three of you who said you did not want to defund the police, why? 60 seconds. And I'm sorry, go ahead. I will ask Tali first. Thank you.
Sure, Jay. Thank you for the question. I am an advocate of reforming the police, and I think that the general arc of police reform looks a lot like the reform of prosecution that has been going on in progressive offices all around the country. So first, there has to be a pulling back the divestment that we talked about earlier from cases that don't advance public safety. Then I think we need to diversify competencies in the police department, as we have in progressive DA's offices, to make sure that the people who are responding know how to respond to the situation, right? So you can have a social worker in the DA's office. You might have a social worker respond to a domestic violence call instead of or with a police officer. And then I think the police have to recommit, as we must recommit, to the core mission of protecting public safety. And, you know, we don't control, as you said, the police budget, but we do have a huge influence on police accountability. One thing that's been on my mind is the prevalence of domestic violence in police families themselves. And, you know, there's some studies that say that domestic violence is 2 to 4 times more likely in police families than it is in a non-police family. What does it mean when someone who has that violence in their home is responding to a domestic violence call? That's the kind of question that I think we have to be asking. And
begging your pardon, I'm really sorry. I've got to move on here, and I want to ask the same question to Diana. What makes you resistant to cuts in the New York City Police Department budget? 60 seconds.
I'm actually not resistant at all. I didn't say that. What I said was I couldn't answer yes or no, because this is an important question. Let me be very clear. I am 100% for reinvesting our resources away from police and into communities. We cannot keep throwing money at police. We can't police our way out of problems. This is something I've been very consistent about. I believe that we need to be looking at mental health and homelessness issues, as well as treatment issues, and taking that away from police. And that will free up police to do the things they're really good at. I've done massive gun trafficking cases with police officers. I've done domestic violence cases. There are things that when we take these bloated things away, and including militarization, we can do it. So I'm actually should be in the other group. To be clear, I believe in defunding in a different manner, but we need to reinvest in our communities.
I do want to move on to the other candidates, but since you're taking this position, I also want to ask 10 seconds for a follow-up. You believe that funding should be taken away from the NYPD. As of right now, do you have a percentage that you think that should be?
I don't know what the percentage is, because I can tell you it should be whatever it will take to adequately fund mental health and homelessness, because for too long, and treatment issues. Because when we do that, it will have
Thank you. I understand. I do need to move on here. Liz, same question. What's your position on this?
I'm all for reallocating the NYPD budget from militarization and back into the communities, but I don't think defunding really will answer some of the problems they're facing. I think you have to really look at the police. Again, it's a mayoral issue, not a DA issue, but I think you have to look at the police, the diversity of the police, having a more diverse police force, having a police force that comes from New York City. And additionally, if New York City police officers are trying to raise a family and raise a family in a decent wage, I think you have to pay them. I think you have to train police officers longer. It should be I did an op-ed about it. It should be 2 years of training where they have an associate's degree. They come out with full psychological testing. You pay them a decent wage. The starting salary right now for police officers is $42,500. I don't think that that's an adequate salary to raise a family of 4 on in New York City. So I think those are the things that we should look about before we talk about cutting defunding.
Liz, quick 10-second follow-up. Again, you say that you do believe money should be reinvested from the police department elsewhere. Do you have a percentage by which you think the NYPD budget should be reduced? 10 seconds.
No, I don't have the NYPD budget in my brain. I believe that there's about $1 billion that could be reinvested in the community from militarization, but I don't have a percentage.
Thank you. I want to turn now to Tahani. Would you call for additional budget cuts in policing this budget cycle and beyond if you were elected DA? And if so, by how much?
Absolutely, and I wouldn't put a limit on it. I'm the only person here that has gone up against the NYPD and held them accountable. I know how the patrol guide works. I know how their legal defense works and how our courts come out on it. And it's important to see police as a last resort. Right now, the NYPD has more contact with New Yorkers than any other city agency, and has been replacing a lot of different city agency functions. And that is one of the reasons why the budget is so bloated, not because they're needed, but because we are defaulting to relying on police, just like we rely on prosecution to address social inequities. So I wouldn't put a limit. As long as there's a place for the public to advocate for a decrease in the budget, we go for it.
Thank you, Tahani. Lucy, same question. Would you call for additional cuts, and how much? 60 seconds.
I'm so proud to have the support of Valerie Bell, Valerie Castile, and Victoria Davis in this race for our work developing protocols for how prosecutors can ensure appropriate accountability in instances of police brutality and misconduct. And that is really where this starts and is at the core of the issue. With respect to defunding, I'm sick of hearing people critique the term. We have for many years in criminal justice reform talked about justice reinvestment, and no one has ever heard of it. Now, finally, advocates have shown a light on these excessive budgets, and the term defund the police has caught on and illuminated this, and like never before. I'm strongly in favor of decreasing the police department budget and allocating resources back to communities through community-led processes.
Can you tell me by how much?
I cannot tell you by how much, Jay.
Thank you. Alvin, same question to you, please.
So I know the value of community reinvestment firsthand. My mother was a career educator. My dad ran homeless shelters. I'm following in their footsteps now through public service and as a Sunday school teacher and a Little League coach. I joined with advocates and opined, wrote an op-ed this summer, joining in the real $1 billion cuts that were being asked for, not the shell game that you discussed up front, Jay. And the three areas I identified in the budget where that money would come from is homeless sweeps. We should be using people like my late father to address the issue of homelessness and not the police. Mental health responses. We shouldn't have the police as the lead responders there. And safety in schools. We've got, police in schools when we need counselors and people like my mother. So that's where I identified the cuts would come from. I know the value of community reinvestment. And as someone who's done cases that actually make us safer, I know that type of policing does not make us safer.
Alvin, do you know by how much you would recommend reducing the budget? Do you have a number in mind?
Yeah, so I joined with the real $1 billion cuts. So they weren't actually made. So I think we need to make them.
Beg pardon, I misunderstood. Thank you. Dan, same question to you.
Now I'm on. Thank you. At least $1 billion in cuts. And I would focus on two specific areas. And I have some experience with this as a legislator representing Midtown Manhattan with Grand Central, as well as parks to the Far East Side. We have significant problems with individuals who are homeless and over-policing in that area. So I think that's one specific area with homeless services where we can divest the police officers in the local precincts and bring in social service actors who can really help in interceding in the area in the area of homelessness. The second is some of the things we saw at the height of the pandemic in New York City in the summer. Unfortunately, under Mayor de Blasio, we had the NYPD doing social distance monitoring. That was a mistake. I said so at the time. And instead, we need that replaced with credible messengers in the community. So that's another area where we can reduce the footprint of the NYPD and add credible messengers and social service agents where we'll get a better result and allow us to reduce the NYPD budget by at least $1 billion.
Thank you, Dan. Lastly to you, Eliza.
Yes, so I'm on the record agreeing with Diane Morales that we can make an at least 50% cut to the NYPD's budget. Unfortunately, as district attorney, I will have no power to actually effectuate that, but there are mechanisms where the DA can actually have a huge impact. And I also have taken on the NYPD on a daily basis in my career as a public defender. And I know how important it is that not only do we invest in communities and make sure that people are receiving the help that they need for mental health issues or substance use disorder, but we are paying out $250 million a year, maybe more, on these lawsuits that the police that are brought against the police, and that's because of the way in which they brutalize and harass and assault members of the community, and yet none of those cases are prosecuted. So as district attorney, I would have a police accountability unit where I will actually hold police officers accountable. I will take them on the same way I've taken them on as a public defender in cross-examining them aggressively and making sure they are actually keeping our communities safe and not brutalizing and assaulting them.
Thank you, Eliza. Candidates, I want to turn now to another key issue in this campaign and in New York City politics in general, what to do about Rikers Island, the notorious jail complex that is slated for closure. But as we all know, the details of this closure are getting a little bit fuzzy. Mayor de Blasio's proposal, submitted to and approved by the City Council last year, says that Rikers should be slated to shut down at the end of 2026, in conjunction with the construction of a set of new borough-based jails at a total cost of about $9 billion. But folks like mayoral candidate Andrew Yang, for example, recently suggested that the timeline for closing Rikers should be, quote unquote, flexible. Obviously, as the COVID-19 pandemic continues to rage, the conditions in which New Yorkers are being kept in confinement in New York City jails should be at the top of all of our priority lists. And a new city council and a new mayor could change this current plan, which again, shutting down at the end of 2026. And of course, a new Manhattan DA could use their bully pulpit to really influence that discussion and have an effect on public opinion. So I'm going to ask about this in two separate stages. First, I'm going to ask about Rikers, and then I'm going to ask about what next. So please feel free to answer this question in as few words as possible. I'll give up to 15 seconds for it, in fact, and then we'll move on to getting a little more into the weeds, if that's okay. So Dan, I will ask you first, 15 seconds. Should Rikers close, and if so, when?
Rikers must close. It's a hellhole. I've done parole hearings there. It's geographically isolated and a place of terrible consequences. So it certainly must close, and we must come forth with a plan to do that. And I don't have
when?
What?
By when should it close?
As soon as possible. It's impossible.
Thank you. I do want to move on. We'll get into a little bit first. I just want to sort of establish the baseline first. Alvin, should Rikers close, and if so, when?
Yes, as soon as possible.
Liz, should Rikers close? If so, when?
Yeah, I mean, as a defense attorney, the defendants come to court from Rikers. They have to get up at 5 a.m. to get to court, to not even be in the courtroom till 2 p.m. It's hard to have visits with your clients. I think Rikers should close, but Rikers is two parts. One part is county jail. The second part.
I do want to give you a chance to get to that, but first I want to understand, if Rikers should close, when do you think it should close?
Well, it's kind of a two-part answer, because the county part should close as on the timeline as people who've studied this have said. But it's a facility for state jails too, for sentence prisoners. And I don't know, it's not clear to me that that's going to close.
I'd like to get into this a little bit later and move on for now to Tahani. Should Rikers close, and if so, when?
Rikers should have been closed yesterday, and the DA's office can be more than a bully pulpit. It can stop filling up places like Rikers, and we should not build new jails.
Oh man, you're really jumping the gun there, but I'll allow it. Lucy, should Rikers close? If so, when?
The only flexibility in the timeline should be to dramatically expedite it. Rikers needs to close as soon as possible.
Eliza, same question.
We should be closing Rikers Island, which is violating human rights and human dignity on a daily basis, immediately.
Diana, same question.
Yes, Rikers Island should close as soon as possible. I'll elaborate later.
Tali, lastly to you.
Yes, as soon as possible.
All right, I appreciate your bearing with me in this format here. So let's move on to what would happen if Rikers were to close, whenever we decide that would happen. New borough-based jails are a subject of major controversy. There are people who say that Rikers can't close without having some new jails elsewhere, while others say that closing one jail and opening a set of smaller jails, not really doing a whole lot about the problem of mass incarceration that closing a facility like Rikers Island is really designed to get at. So I will give each, let's see, how are we doing on time? You know what, let's go for a minute each and close it out here. Should newer borough jails be constructed? And if not, what would you do instead? Lucy, I will ask you first.
I'm opposed to expanding the size in height or in footprint of the Chinatown jail, known as the Tombs. And it's known as that for very good reason. That said, in order to close Rikers Island, there needs to be an investment in improving the conditions in the tombs so that people who are confined there are able to have light, have resources, have educational and vocational programming, and perhaps most importantly, be visited by their families. But none of this is going to be able to be accomplished unless and until the district attorney dramatically reduces the number of people who are being detained pre-trial. And that is going to require a build out of supportive release so that we can end the use of cash bail, but ensure that people can remain at home in their communities while they await their date in court, and that anyone who is detained in humane conditions in a facility that does not cast a literal shadow over Chinatown or anywhere else.
Thank you, Lucy. Alvin, should a set of new borough jails be constructed to replace Rikers Island? And if not, what do you think should happen instead? 60 seconds.
Let me start with the current process. The mayor has botched this process terribly. I'm suing him on behalf of Eric Garner's family around other transparency issues. He's just not getting criminal justice issues right. He didn't see community input, the design and other features, the environmental impact. This all needs to be revisited and looked at again. But the key thing I can say is that under my plans, and this goes back to your earlier questions about the size of the district attorney's office, looking at those 82% of misdemeanors and non-criminal offenses that are brought, I'm going to drastically reduce that. So we're going to need a smaller footprint. I'm not going to use cash bail. So we're going to have a smaller footprint and be able to have a community-involved process and revisit the mayor's botched effort at the citing of those the borough jail plan.
Thank you, Alvin. Tali, should new borough jails be constructed? If not, what would you do instead?
Let's go back to first principles. We're talking about people who are presumed innocent. So while incarceration is always the last resort, even after somebody's convicted, especially before trial, we have to be really careful about who gets detained. That said, sometimes public safety does require that a small number of people be held, and so we need jails. And so I do think the right thing is to shift from Rikers into community-based jails that are adequately considered and that make sense in the communities that they're in.
Thank you. Liz, I'll turn to you next. What do you think about new borough jails?
Well, the MDC is currently on one right next to 100 Center Street. I think that there is a plan to redo that. I don't know that it needs to go taller, but I do think you need to reconstruct that MDC. I think you should put classrooms. I think you should make it a 21st century building where people can, if they have to go to jail, then they come out with skills, teach coding, get a high school degree, get a college degree. I think you have to hold people accountable. I think jail is one of those places that people have to go depending on the crime, depending on the facts. But if we send people to jail, I think we really have to say, okay, we're going to help you get the skills that you need in order to come out and have reentry and do better. So I think that the MDC is a framework for which we can build on.
Thank you, Liz. Diana.
I do not accept the premise that we need new borough-based jails. I, of course, am opposed to keeping Rikers open, but I believe we can do with what we have already. That means that we can look at the actual number of people that we need right now to have a place in jail before anyone does any sort of criminal justice reform within their office. And we don't need the amount of seats that or rather beds that we would have otherwise. But also when you think about the way that I want to change the office to go away from crimes of poverty and crimes of power, we don't need more jails. And we can use that money to reinvest in housing. We have an affordable housing crisis in this city. And in the midst of a pandemic, we should not be spending it on borough-based jails. We can do with what we have already.
Thank you, Diana. Dan, I will turn to you next. Should we build new borough jails? And if not, what should we do instead? 60 seconds.
In order to close Rikers Island, we need a new plan for borough-based jails, but not the mayor's current proposal, which is a faulty and flawed land use proposal and currently on appeal. The White Street facility as proposed in Lower Manhattan is antithetical to the concepts of community-based jails. But what we really need is the next district attorney to not only end cash bail, as I will do, but then remand in most cases. We need to stop sending people to our county correctional facilities, whether that's the Tomb and the 850 beds that are there, or Rikers Island. And this is what I've been fighting for in the legislature for half a decade: ending cash bail, only allowing, remanding people in few circumstances, and sending the majority of people back to their neighborhoods, back to their communities, so they can make rational decisions about their future.
Thank you, Dan. Eliza, same question to you.
Absolutely no new jails, no new prisons. They're not necessary, not now and not in the future, if we put the proper focus on decarceration, both before and after trial. That means never asking for money bail in any form, and certainly not replacing it with a more racist dangerousness standard, and then only seeking pretrial detention in the truly rarest of cases. I'm the only candidate who said that in any case where an assistant district attorney wants to seek pretrial detention, they will have to get my approval specifically. And there are plenty of less restrictive alternatives out there, and we should really be assuring that people are not locked up in the most of the cases that we see come through our criminal legal system. Someone who said, oh, we should make sure people come out okay. Jail does not do that. Incarceration is not helping anyone. It's destroying families, and it's just hurting our communities.
Thank you, Eliza. Lastly, Tahani, same question about new borough jails or the alternatives.
Yeah, as I said earlier, absolutely no new jails. And for people who think that a fresh coat of paint is going to fix things, or even operating under the guise of a community-based jail, makes it sound like a community center. These are jails. They're prisons. They're violent, unsanitary, unhealthy, and they cause the population to age 10 years faster than the average national age. We can't have new jails. And the reason why we're proposing building new jails is because the district attorney has abused its power and put a price tag on the presumption of innocence that has fallen squarely on communities of color. And so not only must we end cash bail, we also have to work on eliminating these technical parole violations that attack the instability where people need help. And instead, we are putting handcuffs, the police, and the prosecution in that place. So when we talk about shrinking the overall footprint of this office, it also means ensuring that we are not relying on police and prosecution at every turn, and instead are putting money directly in the hands of our communities to ensure stability, and stability in housing, education, employment, mental health services, because public safety means public stability, and we're not going to get there without public participation.
Thank you, Tahani, and thank you to all of my guests today. I certainly have more questions I would love to ask each of you, but I do want to be respectful of your time, and 8 candidates, each question infringes a little bit more on that. But again, I do want to thank all 8 candidates for Manhattan DA for joining me today to talk a little bit about the future of New York City's criminal legal system and how they would use that power to hopefully make the city a fairer, safer, more just place. Thank you again for joining me. To our viewers on The Appeal Live, I'm Jay Willis. Please follow Appeal News on Facebook and The Appeal on Twitter for more news, shows, and updates just like this one. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks.